My name is Richard Green, and I'm a senior advisor and a columnist for Route 50. Welcome back to Route 50's State of the SLG Workforce. Prior to the jarring arrival of the pandemic, some states and communities in the United States were allowing a reasonable number of their workers to do their jobs from home. Tennessee was a model in that area, and other states and localities watched closely to see how that worked. But it was a rarity, a really, truly relative rarity. Then over 2 years ago, when the fear of contagion hit us all, many governments were forced, it was a necessity to allow workers who could work from home to work from home. And it's probably worthwhile taking note that though we talk about hybrid work, as we will through the remainder of this conversation, there are many people who have many jobs working for state and local government who cannot work from any place other than their home. Sanitation workers can't pick up the trash in their living room and expect it to come from the neighbor's yard. So we're talking about those jobs that can be hybrid jobs, those jobs that can be remotely worked. Though the pandemic is still with us, there are a lot of big questions about the future of public sector work and how what we've learned over these last few years is going to influence what we're going to see in the years to come. Some places have mandated a return to office. Others are determining what hybrid work even looks like. Nobody knows exactly what the future holds. But based on a series of columns that I've written with my wife and collaborator, Catherine Barrett, for Route 50, of course, it certainly appears as though hybrid is here to stay. I'm excited to be joined by a couple of experts who have done some great work in this space. I'll introduce them briefly. They may tell you a little bit more about themselves. I hope they will, because they both are highly qualified and very, very interesting people. We have with us Kevin Workman, the State Personnel Director in the Department of Administrative Services of the state of Nebraska, and Franklin Pleshtow, the Chief Human Resources Officer for the Human Resources Office in the Washington State Attorney General's Office. Thank you both so much, Kevin and Franklin, for joining us today. And just by way of getting things rolling, it occurs to me that it might be worthwhile, particularly even given what I just said, for us to think back a few years ago when work from home was pretty much a new idea. And then suddenly it became a necessity. How fearful were people in your states and in other states that you know of? And Kevin, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. Well, great to be with you, Rich and Franklin. As always, good to be with you both. So my experience in the public sector and state government is just about 5 years. So prior to that, it was in the private sector for the balance of my career. When I joined state government, remote work was really the exception, few and far between, and not something that was readily adopted or even contemplated. So before the pandemic, there were times and places where it made sense, particularly for times where it was temporary or situations where it was accommodation for a particular employee. But as far as a large scale or a comprehensive look across state government for hybrid work or remote work, we had a policy, but it was not regularly utilized in a practical sense. Most people were in the office at their desks.
And let me just pursue that before Franklin kicks in. So that's how it was. Now suddenly something has to give. We're from the point of view of the HR officials and from the point of view of the employees, how nervous were people about this idea of remote work? I mean, the very word remote kind of sounds alarming.
Well, obviously some positions are better suited for remote work than others. And so some, as you alluded to in your opening remarks, simply don't lend themselves at all to remote work. Our state troopers still need to be in their vehicles. Our children and family services workers still need to be out in the field. So there's certain positions that simply don't lend themselves to remote work. I think that anything that is new and untested brings with it a certain degree of apprehension. And certainly we saw that, just a little bit of anxiety about the unknown. How's this going to work? How are we going to ensure that the work gets done? How are we going to ensure that our customers get served? I'm used to being with the my teammates as a people leader. How do I effectively lead my teams and my teammates? So there was a fair bit of dialogue and just uncertainty about how it might work. So I would say it wasn't greeted with resistance, but certainly there were times of apprehension and anxiety.
In Franklin?
Thank you, Rich, and thank you for the opportunity to join you, and thank you for your and your organization's leadership in this important work. Always appreciate the opportunities to be part of these conversations and learn, and great to see you again, Kevin, as well. My name is Franklin Plaistow, and I am currently the Chief Human Resource Officer for the Attorney General's Office. And prior to that, 9 years before, of the 9 years before this role, I was in a variety of roles that are State Human Resources Office, and most recently served as a State HR Director. So some of what I'll share, Rich, is colored by my experience previous to my most recent role, and certainly looking forward to sharing what I learned now in my new role. So really, probably the important time period in terms of the pre-pandemic experience for the state of Washington in remote, or what we call the modern work environment, as we called it, was really in 2016. We worked extensively with the governor's office to launch an executive order that really tried to move the state towards becoming more and more advanced in thinking about how work is done and meeting the kind of growing needs and expectations of a workforce. And it really fed kind of two important principles. First, we knew that to be competitive in the labor environment, to really find a highly qualified, diverse workforce, we had a responsibility to show up in that marketplace with a work environment that was, if not able to meet in every possible way our competitors, at least resembled that. And we knew part of that was having greater flexibility in work schedules and where people were able to get their work done. Second, there was a recognition that a situation where we had more people maybe working from perhaps home settings, that we were getting more cars off the road, which would help with our transit infrastructure and the roads and highways for other commerce to happen, and also accomplish our executive's goal, our governor's goal in addressing carbon emissions and environmental impacts from maybe unnecessary travel. So again, what I mentioned before, we had a launch of an executive order where we built a framework to have each of our agencies set goals of what they would do to accomplish space and having more and more remote work accomplished where our employees were looking for that. Second, we knew that this was not a matter of just setting the goal. We were also tackling important cultural elements of our organizations. We know that many of us, myself included sometimes, know or supervise by seeing people get work done or seeing people in the office. And so we knew that there was a work to help our leaders become more equipped to supervise in a remote environment. So we developed trainings to help our supervisors understand how they can perhaps still be just as engaged in making sure employees are getting work done, but becoming more comfortable with them perhaps not being in the office every single workday. We also developed a strong infrastructure of advisory groups of senior leaders in our key organizations to help us navigate ensuring that we had the right resources in place to support a more remote, more dispersed workforce. So that was, we made progress there. I will confess it was a slower moving process than perhaps we would have liked to have seen sometimes. I think change is always a challenge, and certainly this was a pretty a big task. I think we had good interest and momentum there, but it probably was not moving at a rate we would want to see. Moving kind of to the pandemic, I think, and you alluded to this at your introduction, Rich, remote work no longer became a nice thing to do or something that you were hoping to accomplish. It became a health imperative for the state of Washington very early on in late February, early March. And we were one of the first states to see some of the COVID outbreaks and respond to it. It was a bit surreal to talk about working from home as a health imperative. It was a way that we kept our employees and we kept our communities safe. So it certainly was transformational, and we continue to learn from that how to come out of this and find our more traditional work patterns. and capitalize on what we learn, but also right size it for what we need to make sure that we're getting the right services to our customers.
That's great. So Franklin and Kevin both, Franklin, you just mentioned the idea, the concern on the part of some supervisors. Actually, a survey just came out recently asking why people were unhappy in their jobs. And the number one answer that came out, I don't remember who did the survey, but the number one answer was, I don't like my supervisor. So now you've given supervisors a whole new task. They've got to oversee people, make sure they're getting their work done in a way that doesn't alienate the staff, but at the same time actually holds them accountable for getting their work done. And again, it's the jobs, I suspect, the jobs that can't be done remotely, that's easier for. I mean, you know if the trash is being picked up or not. You don't necessarily know that an administrative official is getting the work done because it's all a little bit mushy sometimes. So I'd like to hear from both of you. How do you work with the supervisors to help them to make sure their people are doing what needs to be done without scaring people off?
Yeah, well, I think one of the great benefits that we had, of course, there was no way to know that the pandemic was coming, but our current administration and Governor Ricketts, early in his first term, had established what we call our Center of Operational Excellence, where we engaged in Lean Six Sigma methodology, process improvement to gain efficiency, effectiveness, and customer service. And so our teams embedded within our agencies was a culture that was building where we had daily huddles. We had a metrics board that was reviewed on a daily basis. So people were coordinating and cooperating and collaborating on a regular basis. And there were ready metrics and measures of success that were viewed on a regular basis by the teams to determine if the work was being done. And so when the state was faced with a number of those remote workers and teams needing to go remote, we were able to quickly pivot to an electronic version of these physical huddle boards, if you will. And the teams were able to meet through Zoom, WebEx, different platforms. Our enterprise IT team pivoted quickly to make sure that we had the infrastructure and resources for VPNing in, the laptops that we needed, the tools that we needed to work successfully. And so our leaders, for the most part, were set up for success if they were already utilizing these huddles and leadership techniques and metrics. It went over and transferred to the remote environment very well. And so that just reinforced a culture that we try to make sure that we're having for our teammates experience, where we want positive relationships with their direct leaders. And so that was pre-pandemic where we worked on that. And obviously there's always opportunity for growth in those areas, but we try to equip people leaders to lead their teams with servant leadership and collaborate with their teammates. And so when the challenges of a remote relationship come into play, they have that foundation of trust and relationship that's there. So, I wish I could say that was the case in every situation. Probably not across the breadth of our enterprise, but that's what we were endeavoring to do pre-pandemic.
Great points, Kevin. If I may just build off of that a little bit. First, Rich, something in your comment at the beginning, I know there's an expression that people use sometimes that people don't usually quit their jobs, they quit their supervisors, which is true. That supervisor relationship is so important. And even our employee engagement surveys, we generally see really high scores in terms of relationship between supervisors and employees. And we do want, as we see a more mobile work environment, we do think about how important it is to keep that relationship strong. If I may just channel a little bit of, this could be just more optimism, and I want to make sure that I then anchor it in reality and in empiricism, that I believe, and I experienced, and as I talked to leaders, we saw a lot of our supervisors and leaders through the pandemic begin to appreciate and experience our employees in a more complete way. When they're working from home, home life becomes part of work a little bit more. And I think from that, we started to see times where our employees and our leaders saw the humanity in employees more and more. And I know there's days that maybe we feel like we don't quite get there, or there's gaps in that, but I guess I hold on to that anchor as a useful belief to hope kind of shape how we think about employee engagement and our relationship with our colleagues, both in the chain of command and across our organization, as something to hold on to. I think Kevin nicely hit some of the elements that of having a culture where we already had huddles and check-ins and leveraging technology to be successful in that. So we saw more and more our successful organizations use Teams or Zoom or the appropriate kind of resources in their ecosystems to keep those connections built, and the deployment of kind of more just-in-time communications. So I think those are areas where we've seen some building of relationships, and I think using technology. I think one area of risk that I know Kevin and I have talked about over the year, over the months that we worked together and talked through these issues, even is about just as we go more towards a hybrid environment now, and as we see our offices, of course, more and more open as they need to be to make sure we're giving the services to our customers, we also have, rarely do we have full offices. 100% full offices are no longer the norm. And I don't think they will be for the foreseeable future, or perhaps ever. And I think a responsibility now that we have as leadership is how do we make sure that we honor inclusion and belonging when we'll rarely see everyone in the room together. And so watching for, I think, a key indicator about employee engagement in terms of the relationships you have with your colleagues is a high indication of your satisfaction. I know it's important to me, and I think it's important to many of our employees as we look at our employee engagement results. How do we make sure relationships sustain as people are in a blended environment? I felt like when everyone was home because they had to be, we all were talking in a way that it was in the same thing, that connections were happening. Now where you are having hallway conversations or those just-in-time conversations, how are we also now going to make sure that those that are not there that day are also included and also in the loop and not feeling like they're having behind the communication curve on elements? And that's an area that if I don't lose sleep over, at least I wake up thinking about as I kind of reflect on the hybrid model that we're starting to, that we see going forward.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you said there. And, we just had a recent conversation just about the importance of relationships. And so in that conversation, I talked about the fact that I kind of operate from the base premise that certainly in state government, if not beyond that, ultimately everything that we do is with people and for people. So healthy, belonging, inclusive, growing relationships that are characterized by trust, camaraderie, a sense of team. All those things are critical in both environments, whether it's in the office, remote, or a hybrid. But it presents some layers of complexity when we have a remote workforce. Under my purview, I have state personnel as well as our central HR shared services. And probably 90% of my team is working either primarily remote or some version of hybrid. And so we've kind of been navigating through how do we maintain those healthy relationships personally. And I would totally agree with what Franklin just said. Just doing the Zoom calls where people are sitting in their home environment. And today I chose to be in my home office. So you're seeing my home office in the background. But when you see some things here, you're going to learn some things about me personally that you may not have learned in an office, or it may prompt you to ask some questions. So there's been some advantages. But then we've had to balance, how do we have a whole team, and there's really no substitute for being face to face. So one of the things that we're doing with the teams that I get to serve is, our bi-weekly leaders meetings. One of them will be in a Zoom call like this, and then the other one will be in person. And so we try to balance and meet those needs as well as we can, and emphasize the importance of building relationships as a two-way street. In a conversation I had with Franklin just recently, he was talking about it's not just the employer's responsibility to do everything we can to make sure people have that sense of belonging and inclusion, but it's also incumbent upon teammates themselves to invest in the relationships and in the team as well. So I don't know that we have everything perfectly figured out. I don't know that we ever will, but those are some of the principles that guide us as we make course adjustments as necessary. And so far, so good.
Kevin, I'm curious. I just want to drill down to something that you just spoke about, which is the idea that sometimes one way that you can coordinate people so that everybody can be together in a meeting, even when some people might not be coming into work that day, is by having some people on a Zoom like we are right now, and some people actually in the office. Don't the people who are operating on Zoom take a secondary position to the people who are actually in the room, since typically the supervisor's in the room?
I think that observation is a valid dynamic. And one of the things that we try to do is utilize our technology in a way that minimizes that dynamic. So whether it's a Zoom room or having a big flat screen with a camera that makes it a better experience for those who are remoting in, making sure that we have a microphone and video that support everybody equally, so that we don't have somebody who's trying to hear or they can't see, or they feel left out. So there are definitely obstacles that situation presents, and we do the best we can with the technology available. And then when we do an in-person meeting, we do our best to schedule it so that everybody can be there in person. So but there are situations where somebody can't be, and so we do the best that we can. But that's a noteworthy observation, and Franklin, maybe you have a great answer that we haven't discovered yet.
Well, I may disappoint on a great answer, but it's certainly an area that I've thought about. And I think something that weighs on my heart quite a bit is when I think about some of the factors that may be shaping why we have people working remotely. So my mind does gravitate towards an employee, and we may have a workforce where perhaps a working parent is in a situation where the working remotely, working home on a more frequent basis is important in terms of being able to bridge any health or childcare gaps or any other dynamics there. And so certainly thinking about how we show up as an employer first, and making sure that we're thoughtful about inclusion, belonging, and connection to the team carries there. I also think about if we're being thoughtful about how we use remote work to perhaps even recruit in more diverse communities, then we're not as thoughtful about how we think about the engagement approach there, then my mind goes towards, and my heart goes towards, how that will impact our workforce and those individuals. So I think that there's part of it about how do we as an employer really engage in a process where we can build the right technology, the right resources. I think Kevin spoke to some of the things that many of our organizations are looking at, and we're working with them on about how we can, from a technology perspective, from a resource perspective, have meetings and have connections that are that remove the Zoom participant or the remote participant, like they're kind of a observer of a meeting as opposed to a participant in a meeting. And I think that, and Kevin mentioned this before, is there's also a responsibility, I think, for remote workers about, and the employer can help equip this, but there's also a degree of personal accountability about how to make sure that you are reaching out and engaging with the parts of the team so that things are not getting passed over or that you're out of the loop on things. And so I think there really is it's a gap we have here. And I think both sides of the bridge, both sides of on the sides of the gap need to build a bridge towards how to make that work. I really wish I had the perfect solution. I know even personally, we had an all staff meeting recently that was remote, and we're getting better at it, but and as I've worked with senior leaders across our organization, I don't think we've quite found the perfect mix for that. And I'm really excited to continue to to work and learn in that space as well.
I appreciated your thought, Franklin, when you talked about the reasons some people are working remotely. And I think family responsibilities can be a big part of that. And even pre-pandemic, we piloted in our agency a kids at work policy that we still have in place. And it's sometimes people are a little reluctant to embrace that. And so we've had to continually reinforce and kind of mold that culture that, yeah, it's okay. If for some reason your daycare worker can't, calls off for some reason, or they unexpectedly close the school, bring your kid to work. It's fine. It's okay. If you have a child and they're younger, they can sit in your lap. We can still continue on. And certainly that same freedom in a remote setting. And so I've gotten to know children and pets and spouses of people on my team through the remote that I might not have encountered otherwise. But every time we do that in an accepting way, that helps kind of knock down this stereotypical idea that I'm at work, I have to kind of be this rigid, totally professional. We can still get the work done. We can do it fun. We can, and in some ways we become more productive as a result of that.
So it feels to me like what both of you appear to be saying is that people must be happier now. I mean, it sounds to me, I mean, goodness knows, I know an awful lot of people who pre-pandemic, when they're working out of an office, childcare problems were always an issue. The sitter couldn't make it, or the daycare place closed down. The daycare place closed down because all the kids had lice. And suddenly there you are, and what do you do with your child? You got to get to the office, and it's a big problem. These kinds of, the kind of flexibility that hybrid work provides, and I know in Nebraska, from what you've just been saying, and I know it's true in Washington as well. Do people seem to be happier? I know Washington does all kinds of, and I suspect Nebraska does too. I don't know that for sure, but there's all kinds of employee surveys. Do people like this better than they liked the old days?
In the autonomy space, it's, I guess I had a pause there. Everything's happier. I think, we have some employees who like that home is home and work is work. And so as we have now a hybrid option, I think we are seeing employees find their way for what works best for them. So I think we are getting closer to autonomy, because you could argue during the peak, the depths of the pandemic, however you want to look at it, that there is we were all home. And I think that was actually, we started to see that actually impacted wellness as well. Because I know I said earlier, home can show up in your work, but also work showed up at home. And I think we saw employees who struggled with ending their Zoom calls at 5. And maybe the stress and the impact of work is now right there at home with, a kid who's struggling with their math homework, or, whatever may be the other things that are important in our lives to tend to, and feeling like there was not a healthy balance there. So I'm optimistic that now that we have, greater autonomy here of employees finding the way, that maybe we're closer to what we tried to do in 2016, which was give employees the discretion to determine how the work gets done, as long as the work's getting done. And so I think in some ways I'm optimistic there. Overall, are employees happier? Well, that's a tougher question. There's a lot of variables that are going on around the world, around our ecosystem, that can shape that as well. Obviously, the compensation story and other things that are not messaged, to the remote work environment element, are impacting perhaps how employees are there. So overall, our numbers are positive, but they have dipped a little bit in the most recent survey we did in November of last year. So, I think it's an area that we must continue to watch, but I'm interested in what Kevin has to say about that as well.
Well, I would agree. Overall, people have really welcomed the opportunity for flexibility in their life. So those positions in state government that afford remote work or hybrid work, certainly on my team universally have been accepted with a lot of enthusiasm. And you think of people who are commuting in Nebraska. I have a person on my team who has an hour commute into the office. Well, we all know what the prices for gas are now. So, just not only saving the time on the road, but it makes sense fiscally, environmentally. There's all of those um, side effects or added benefits that come into play that have been very, very well embraced. Some people said it's almost like getting a raise. Um, I'm not buying a lunch at work. I'm not spending the commuting time. I'm more efficient. And so again, we have to balance everything out, but it's been accepted pretty well across the board for those positions that it works for. I think that, last year with our engagement scores and everything, we didn't necessarily have all the demographical information to slice and dice the information by those who were working remotely. And I think some of the factors that came to play during the pandemic probably maybe outliers in terms of survey results on employee engagement. And maybe as things normalize post-pandemic, we'll have a better way to measure that. But overall, it's been well received. And I may have missed a part of the question. If I did, feel free to restate it, and I'll try to address that as well.
No, you both of you answered the question really well. And I'd like to shift gears and go to one last topic, and then we'll sum up, because this has moved so quickly. We could talk for hours and hours, but I suspect that the people at Route 50 would not want us monopolizing the full day of activities. The single noun that it feels to me came up most frequently in both of your conversations is technology. Right, because this is all contingent on technology. This isn't something, you could have a lousy office space or a nice office space. You could have bookshelves at your office like I have in my den here, and people could get their work done. If the technology isn't working really well, then we've got problems here. What have you done? And maybe if you could each take this for a minute or two, what have you done to make sure that the employees themselves are trained in the technology they need to use and actually have the technology, so they're not working from, they're not going on Zoom from their 2019 cell phone?
It was so impressive that our IT team at a statewide level was able to pivot when the pandemic first happened. And that was such an impressive moment. It was one of those moments that I didn't know if they'd pull it off. My uninformed perspective, I didn't know if it could happen, but they made it happen, and it was very impressive. I think now, as we start to see how offices are working and what their schedules look like, we are now in a better position to be able to kind of redeploy technology. So many of our organizations have really worked towards having packages that are designed for our more remote workers, and then those that we have for our more office resident workers. And really getting the right resources there. And in terms of training, it's been mainly just in time as deployed training, but I think generally has gone really well in the organizations that I've been closer to. But again, I think now that we're starting to see what an open environment looks like and how employees are showing up, we're getting some good calibration there.
Kevin?
Yeah, I just reinforce what Franklin said there. I'm very proud of our IT support team on how they were able to really accelerate what was already in motion in response to the pandemic to position us, and not just for our remote workers, but you think of all the testing that was going on, the call centers that had to be ramped up. There was an incredible amount of work. We found out what we were able to accomplish, and I think it far exceeded what we thought we might be able to accomplish. So that's been a great learning lesson for us, that we've exhibited agility, flexibility, and resilience that probably outpaced what we thought our capabilities were. So that's a great place to be. It's just a reality of the current age that we live in, that technology is how we get things done. And so to the extent that we can, we have redundancy in those systems to ensure functionality if there are issues. And then in critical places, having continuity of operations plans that we can put into place to make sure that we're serving our citizens should something disrupt that.
That's great. Those are both good answers. And as we close up, I'm going to give you each 30 seconds to say the one thing that didn't come up in conversation, but that you think is important for our audience to know about remote work, or I should say hybrid work. And to Franklin, 30 seconds, and I'm timing you now.
Thank you. I think my hope is that we don't lose the progress we made in the moment of the crisis, just the incredible things that we did accomplish, that we don't move back to kind of status quo. And I know we talked a little bit about it, I just want to amplify that, my last point.
That's terrific. That was 22 seconds.
Well, I'm gonna kind of build off what Franklin said. Too easy when a quote unquote crisis passes, there's a gravitational pull to go back to where we've been. And we've made some incredible progress. And so we have the opportunity to build on that. In many ways, it thrust us forward years and years in state government that probably would not have happened at that pace had not there been the pandemic. So we want to build on these things and make our workplaces even better and improve our services to our citizens.
That's terrific. Thank you both so much. Kevin, Franklin, that's all the time we have. I really regret it. I'm hoping you can stick around so we can just chat. But I want to thank you for making time to join us today. I'm now going to hand it over to Alicia Powell-Gillis, my colleague and friend, for our final session of the day. And for Route 50, I'm Rich Green, and thank you.
Clark County is an $8 billion public enterprise. We serve 10,000 employees across 140 different locations. We are an outcome-driven organization. We have strategic goals, we have objectives. Prior to COVID, in the IT department, we were talking about experimentation. COVID didn't give us a chance to experiment. It just said, you're gonna do it for everybody and that's how we're gonna roll. That has probably been one of the best things for our employees. With VMware's help, we have been able to pivot 10,000 employees to a remote workforce in a matter of a couple of weeks. We were able to have that partnership to be able to move and have devices and hardware for people so they are able to work from anywhere.
Prior to the pandemic, with regards to the number of people working remote or hybrid, I would say the percentage was 0. That was not a county directive. There was not a need to have people working remotely. I mean, you had family services people that were working in the field, however, they would still come back into the office to do their work.
We have about 400 employees in our department. Prior to many of the updates that we did, there was a limit on what they were able to do out in the field. So that whole process has been streamlined. They're able to just boot up their computer, their laptop, wherever they are. They can do it from their car. If they happen to be at a visit in a family's home, they're able to do that from the home and still stay connected with their supervisor and their teammates.
They were able to file reports. They were able to take photographs via their cell phones, transfer it to their OneDrive environment, utilize Teams in order to have Teams meetings. The huge increase in the ability for that specific department to work remotely utilizing Dell computers and Workspace ONE and VMware tools and technologies. To me, it's unprecedented to see something like that in what this environment looked like at the beginning.
Workspace ONE has been fantastic for us. Makes it so much easier for us to roll out devices, to have all the applications on the devices that are needed for our employees. So we have data that is CGIS compliant, we have PCI data, we have HIPAA data. We have to be very, very careful about who has access to it and what kind of permissions are set up and what that data is being used for. COVID has been a terrible human tragedy globally. Probably the only silver lining that has come out of it is the ability for us to accelerate, the ability for us to transform, and the ability for us to rethink. So we've been able to prove that with productivity metrics. We've been able to measure the outcomes. There's no reason for us to not be able to support a hybrid model. No reason for us to go back.